Hello and welcome to my conversation today with Isabelle Reinecke about her fabulous new essay in the Monash in the National Interest series, Courting Power, Law, Democracy and the Public Interest in Australia. I'm Emma Dawson. It's good to see those of you I haven't seen for a while. I've been away, but I'm back at the desk. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here. I am coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, regardless of the disappointing outcome of the recent referendum. We are on land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you for joining us on your lunch break today for this webinar in our series. I'm particularly chuffed to be talking with Isabelle. We're fellows at the Women's Leadership Institute of Australia. Welcome, Isabelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I told Emma just before we started, no matter what I do, I still find a way for something to buzz. And I think that my phone just started ringing. So I'm sorry about that. I've
not at all. Little bit of housekeeping at the start. We will, as usual, I'll be very happy to put any questions to Isabelle towards the end of our time together today. Please leave those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the chat function if you'd like to introduce yourselves to one another and comment more generally, but I will be looking for questions in that Q&A function at the bottom. And it's a particularly timely conversation we're having, Isabelle, because the first thing I want to do is congratulate you and your team at Grata Fund for a win in the High Court today.
Thank you. Yes, it's amazing news this morning. We knew that we were getting a decision at 10 a.m. this morning. Obviously, you never know which way it's going to go. And this is a case that was brought by two now sadly passed leaders from Santa Teresa, which is about an hour out of Alice Springs. It's a remote community, and they had brought a series of cases, or what turned out to be a series of cases, in response to really terrible housing conditions in the territory. What people in the community there were facing were, over 600 urgent repairs that had been ignored by the NT government, their landlord, for years and years and years. They finally brought litigation that established that they have a right to humane housing. It's one of those funny things where you think, God, why does it require litigation to establish that? But it did. It did. And, the territory government did everything it could to get out of that case, including threatening the community with $2 million in rental arrears that once it got to court, the court chucked out immediately because there was absolutely no evidence for that claim. But the community continued and really was arguing that they deserved compensation, not just for the physical damage or the physical, for example, in Ms. Young's situation, she didn't have a back door and didn't have a lock on that back door for 5 years, among a range of other problems. And in the same way that if you or I didn't have a back door, that leads to a kind of this, constant state of stress and concern about no ability to just sort of be in your home comfortably and safely or leave it. And the High Court today has recognised that, yes, you are actually entitled to compensation for that distress as well. That's really exciting, really massive win that has implications for actually government tenants around the country, which is really exciting.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Something that with my colleagues and Matt Lloyd-Cape and Lucy Tonkin and Margaret McKenzie at the Centre for Equitable Housing, we've been taking such a deep dive into housing rights and regulations. And as you said, just to find that there are no standard rental regulations or no standard rental quality requirements across the country, but to see that even in public housing where the government is the landlord, something that's quite shocking to people.
And the other thing as well that I think really has struck me about this situation, this case, is that people are paying really expensive rents for these properties as well. It's not as though it's some sort of gifted property that's crap. Not that would even be okay, but, people are paying. Ms. Young was paying more rent than I was paying for her essentially shed than I was paying in Tamarama in Sydney. It's really despicable. But, she'll be compensated for her rent there, or her estate will be compensated for her rent over that period, but now she'll also be able to be compensated for the distress that caused. And I think the thing for us at Grata is we're not the litigators ourselves. We're not Ms. Young or the community's legal team. We work to sort of connect the dots strategically behind the scenes. So we provide the philanthropic funding that's needed to get these cases through court. And we also provide the kind of campaign strategy and legal strategy around the cases. So her lawyers are Australian Lawyers to Promote Aboriginal Rights, and with their barrister Matt Albert from the Victorian Bar, really terrific pro bono team. But for us at Grata, really the strategy long term for a case like this is to make the compensation bill so extraordinarily high for the territory that they are forced to come to the negotiating table and start to co-design housing policy with community legal service organisations, with community controlled organisations, which they've been avoiding doing for a long time.
It's such an important win, not just for the people directly affected, but as you just noted, for the future of how we devise, develop, deliver social housing across the country. So thank you on behalf of those of us that are very concerned with social housing provision, and particularly in remote communities. You touched on there a little bit about Grata's role in this case. And for those joining us today that don't know much about Grata, before we get into the broader philosophical challenges posed by your excellent essay, tell us a little bit about how Grata came to be, why you started it and what it does.
Sure. So my background was in corporate law, and then I also spent time in nonprofits and doing all sorts of nonprofit sort of work, including working on stolen wages in remote WA, working at GetUp as head of legal, but started my career at kind of one of the big bad firms at Clayton Utz. And once I was at GetUp, I really saw that, if you could combine the power of law and courts and what they provide if you have the financial means with the power of community activism and campaigning, you really had this potential for creating big change where other mechanisms have failed. So litigation is really, really powerful where you've got intractable issues where governments or corporates can't or won't act. And so you kind of, I guess, start to worry less about whether they're doing what they're doing because they don't want to or because they can't, and you focus on actually just making sure that they obey the law. So with that kind of principle in mind, I was sort of wondering, why aren't we having more of this sort of big litigation in Australia the way you see globally? And the answer to that question is complicated, but part of it is our adverse cost system. And that means for anyone who is lucky enough to have not participated in litigation, that means that if you bring litigation, you have to pay the other side's legal bill if you lose. And that's a pretty fair principle for the most part. So, if you're Coles and you've sued Woolworths, you have to pay the other side's bill, in private disputes as well. But when you're talking about a remote community trying to enforce their legal rights, it's completely unacceptable. And the rest of the world has adapted their laws to make it possible for people in the public interest to bring cases, but Australia hasn't. And so to that end, the starting point was, okay, well, we can reform the adverse cost system. There's been, multiple Law Reform Commission reports at multiple jurisdictions to change this system. Nothing's happened. Let's work on that long term, but let's just move some money in the interim. And so I started working with philanthropists to kind of insure people, so without any premium. So saying to people, look, if you take this case and you lose and you need to pay costs, we'll cover it for you. And that was sort of the starting point. But then what kind of grew out of that is obviously my experience at GetUp being quite influential, but then also going overseas on a Churchill Fellowship and meeting all the kind of granddaddies, or I should maybe say grandmamas of strategic litigation globally, and really learning from them in terms of how you maximize the impact of litigation, both to build community power through the timeline of litigation and kind of community building and community organizing over the stretch of the litigation cycle, but also using the attention that's drawn by litigation of media and decision makers to really create change outside of the court. And so from there, what has developed is our kind of current organization, which is really focused on supporting high impact strategic litigation and providing wraparound campaign support for cases that focus on democracy, climate justice, and human rights, which is sort of everything. And I kind of started it with that in mind because I just didn't know whether the need was going to be, but as it turns out, the need is everywhere. And that means that we've kind of had the great pleasure and privilege to work on really amazing cases like that out of Santa Teresa that won today.
Well, thank you for the work you've done. I mean, I obviously the longer term goal will be to see Australia reform its system so that public interest cases don't attract the same, what is effectively a penalty or a disincentive to proceed. But in the meantime, having Grata Funds clearly making a difference as shown today. So
it'd be nice to do ourselves out of business. We actually are having some kind of success to start with, actually, out of the Respect at Work reform. So the Human Rights Commission recommended that costs be changed in sex discrimination litigation. And we have been working with the Attorney General's Department to try and get that into a good position. So it looks like we will have a bill introduced to Parliament pretty soon that should reform that for sex discrimination. So that's an exciting starting point, and we'll keep going from there.
In end of the wedge, as they say, we use it to surprise.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, congratulations again. And I'll move on now to talking more broadly about your excellent essay and point out to those watching that in the chat, Meredith on my team has posted a link where you can buy this essay with a 20% discount just for joining us today. And I do recommend you do so. It's very accessible, readable, but really concentrates my mind on what has happened over the last kind of 30 years or so, that we've been a little bit like boiling frogs in Australia when it comes to the attacks on our judiciary. We see what has happened in the US, obviously, with the stacking of the Supreme Court, with decades of conservative agitation to really push a very conservative view on the court system over there. Many of us were appalled recently. Looking at the Middle East is just a daily exercise in being appalled and distressed at the moment. But looking at Netanyahu's attacks on the judiciary in Israel. But what you so cogently point out in this essay is that we've seen a similar occurrence here. It's been more muted, but it's certainly since the Mabo and the Wick decisions in the 90s, we've seen growing undermining of the independence of our court, and a lot of conservative voices importing what we see as those US arguments around judicial activism. Take us through a bit of the history that you cover without spoiling the essay for those yet.
Yes, I mean, I think the key thing to watch for is when First Nations rights are at stake, and when particularly land rights are at stake. So what you first saw was immediately post Mabo was these pretty ferocious attacks on and Wick, and pretty ferocious attacks on the judiciary, quite personalised attacks from senior politicians, but also the kind of commentariat. But senior politicians, including who was to become, and then at the time, Deputy PM Tim Fischer, really calling for, in papers, the appointment of capital C political conservatives to the High Court as a way of dealing with this terrible thing that was the Mabo decision. And the establishment of Samuel Griffith Society, which, was recently in a Janet Albrechtsen column as the birthplace of the No referendum campaign last year, which sort of says it all. And really what there was this reaction from, agriculturalists, pastoralists and so on, saying the court's gone too far. Yeah. It's completely inappropriate for the role of the court, which is, antithetical to actually the entire legal community and, very senior members of the legal community who were pretty quick to rebuff those sorts of attacks. But that was sort of just the beginning. And since then, I think those attackers learnt their lesson, that they'd gone too far, they'd gone too hard, too direct to the bench. And instead what happened is a sort of transmutation of that kind of attack on the court system, and really went beyond the courts as well. So there were the attacks on courts, but also then attacks on the ecosystem that enable the court to do its job. So, for example, environmental organisations like the EDO were committing vigilante lawfare through their environmental litigation. Dutton was calling the lawyers for refugees un-Australian for doing their work. And then we also saw the importation of this language of judicial activism. And so really, if you see judicial activism raised, literally what that is telling you is that person doesn't like the outcome, but they have no legal analysis of the decision. And so even Robert French was sort of asked, his Honour, former Chief Justice of the High Court, was asked in his press club address just before the referendum. I think the first question he was asked was, what about judicial activism? To which he said, there's no such thing, really. Well, if you see it, it's sort of a red flag for you. But that language has been pervasive, and I think it's had a few different impacts. in the court system today. One, which is the most obvious and direct and probably causal, which is the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So the AAT, where you go for your first sort of dispute resolution if you've got a problem with the government. So you've had a FOI rejected, you've had a visa rejected, or so on. You had a robo-debt complaint. And, you know, what we were seeing was that if you had been appointed by a coalition member, you were twice as likely to have your visa rejected if you were a refugee applicant. And that was still holding for all of the other variations. So it was a massively politicized result that you were getting, to the point that Dreyfus announced that he would be disbanding it when Labor was elected. And so we're yet to see what this new version of the AAT looks like. But that's pretty significant if you're seeing you're literally one of the most foundational tribunals in the country, one of the most accessible in terms of the costs, actually having to be disbanded after 50 years of kind of bipartisan running.
Yeah. I mean, I think it became increasingly egregious over the last few years of the previous government. But as you say, to get to the point where the incoming Attorney General says, actually, so broken, can't fix it, have to start from scratch, is really telling of just how those appointments have skewed the operation of justice. We were talking briefly before this, and we were in furious agreement when I was reading the book. What emerged really strongly to me was that most of these, or all of these disputes around, you know, activist judges, judicial activism, the conservative voices calling for a black letter interpretation of the Constitution. In America, that's tended to be most obviously around reproductive rights, most recently in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Here it's about property rights, isn't it? It's about land, really, whether it's Mabo and Wick, or whether it's refugees, managing who comes into the country. It's really those disputes emerge when people feel that the court is threatening the right of the white man, of the settler, of the colonialist to control this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we were talking about this earlier, and, you know, I really think, especially out of the result of the referendum and how that was won and the lines that were persuasive for that campaign, I really see land rights and the Mabo decision becoming this sort of central organising pillar of conservatives in Australia, or kind of deep conservatives in Australia, in the same way that Roe v. Wade and abortion rights access was in the US and has been in the US. I think that they're less likely to have success on turning back Mabo, but they could have success in other ways that are profound in terms of people's experience in the world, not just in court, but outside of it. And I think it's to that exact point. So, you know, I mentioned that, you know, there was this immediate kind of Mabo-Wick furor that was directed really pointedly at the judges. Yeah. And then you didn't really see that again at the High Court level, not in a serious, coordinated way, until the Love and Tom's decision in 2020. And that decision was a decision by the High Court that effectively the Australian government can't deport Aboriginal people from Australia and strip them of their citizenship, even if they'd been born, for example, in Papua New Guinea. So there was an instance of a couple of men who had been born overseas, one in Papua New Guinea, one in New Zealand, but who very much were First Nations people of Australia in kind of every sense of the world, of the word rather, and, you know, hadn't spent much time in their countries of birth at all. And the Australian government had given itself the power to deport people who had been convicted of a crime over a certain length of time as non-citizens if they'd been born overseas. But the court said, no, there is this special connection with this place for First Nations people that cannot be replaced. And that builds on the Mabo precedent. And that's really threatening to a group of people who, as you say, you know, are concerned about connection to land and ownership of land, because what that is again doing is acknowledging this special connection to this continent that is unique to First Nations people, and that's very threatening. And so after that decision is when you then saw this absolutely massive wave of attack on the High Court, you know, printing out everyone's photos, whether they'd voted for or against, you know, whether they're a good judge or a bad judge, purely based on whether they'd disagreed or agreed with the decision. And then calling very explicitly, again, in Tim Fischer style, for the appointment of capital C political conservatives, you know, including, you know, Senator Amanda Stoker, Senator James Patterson, you know, making significant speeches actually at Samuel Griffith Society conferences, calling for those appointments as a response to that decision, calling for, in different places, Samuel Griffith Society or some other entity to do a better job of the sort of work that the Federalist Society does in the US, and, you know, is sort of responsible for the movement that has led to the reversal of Roe v. Wade and a range of other important rights cases in the US. And I thought at the time, oh, this is funny, they've overstepped again. They've gone too far. You know, interesting that they've given it another crack, but, you know, they won't kind of get away with it. And I think what was alarming to me was that, so 2 appointments were up in 2020.
Yep.
To the High Court, and, you know, people retire at a certain age, which means that, you know, spaces become available, and that means Christian Porter, as Attorney General, had the opportunity to appoint 2 judges. Those 2 judges were both celebrated by the IPA as wins. IPA wanted the kind of lead campaign voices for the appointment of political conservatives, and by, you know, all means, people claim wins sometimes when they don't necessarily have them. Sometimes when the person who's been claimed as a win wouldn't really appreciate it. You know, you've made it to the High Court, not just because you're a kind of floozy of the IPA. But the thing that I think was more alarming than the claiming of the win was then the decision of, in particular, one judge who was appointed, Justice Simon Stewart, who, in his first judgment that considered the implied freedom of political communication, which is this hugely significant precedent, about 30 years old, made around the same time as Mabo, just before, which says that, you know, in order for our system to work properly, you need to be able to freely communicate political information. And an example of that would be voting. You know, we don't have voting rights in the Constitution, but our system couldn't work if you didn't have the right to express your political view through voting. And there's kind of lots of other iterations of that. But Simon Stewart, in that first judgment, despite everybody else on the court saying this is well-settled law, said, I don't think it's well-settled law, and essentially, you know, posed an invitation for how you would enable him to reopen, in his words, the questions. And, you know, it's one judge on a bunch of 7, but I was really influenced particularly by the words of Professor Adrian Stone, who is a kind of absolutely eminent constitutional scholar out of Melbourne University, and kind of not as well known as people like Anne Toomey and George Williams, but just does less press, but is kind of on that level. And she said that, you know, she wouldn't have thought 15 years ago that Roe v. Wade could have been undone the way that it was. And she sees the same sorts of red flags in that judgment from Simon Stewart. And not just because of the judgment, but because of what I think is actually probably a more diffuse and sort of less causal, but I think there is a causal relationship, impact of this sort of anti-court kind of campaign, which is that the court has become, particularly in certain areas, particularly to do with constitutional issues, extremely rigid and technical in its approach, and really avoids dealing with the substantive democratic principles that underpin decisions. So a decision like the implied freedom of political communication originally 30 years ago really was about, okay, what is the democratic principle we are trying to uphold? Thus, what does that mean for how we interpret the law? And what we've got now is courts that don't air those democratic principles, but of course they have them. It's impossible to make these decisions without them. And so that because they're not aired, they're not able to be interrogated. But also what it means is you have, you know, as Professor Stone kind of talks about, this sort of brittle implied freedom doctrine. And what that, you know, what that might look like to, you know, the audience is, you know, you see a case being brought by Annika Smethurst. She was raided by the AFP for producing stories about plans to spy on Australian people. The day before or the day after, the AFP also raided the ABC for reporting on war crimes by Australian soldiers committed in Afghanistan. And Annika Smethurst's case was successful in the High Court, but the court didn't deal at all with the democratic principle of a free press. It just went to, before getting to that point, to said, look, there's a technicality, there's a problem with the warrant.
That's right.
It was not lawful. And the AFP the next day put out a press release basically saying, no, it's okay, we just got the warrant wrong. And then interestingly, you see the effect of that, the level down, is the federal court makes a decision about the ABC being raided and says, no, you haven't breached the implied freedom. Because if we don't actually address in judgment the democratic principles, you have a flow-on effect that means there's these sort of random outcomes, but you also have these highly technical kind of legal arguments and ways of determining a question that sort of end up eating themselves, which make them kind of brittle and open to kind of long-term degradation through, you know, people potentially like Simon Stewart and others.
And that's really intention of these movements that are, seeking to undermine the court is to create that brittleness, to create that tension around the role of the court, and to try to reduce the role of the court, as we've seen in America. And as when we talk here about those capital C conservative judicial appointments, we're talking about people or a movement that wants the courts only to interpret the Constitution in particular as it was written at the time it was written. So like a frozen document that reflects the wishes of the founding fathers, as they call them in America, here really the Federalists that created our Constitution, and never let that become a living document that can grow, that can evolve with changed community norms, with contemporary values. It's restricting the court's ability to interpret the law against a moral or democratic framework. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think the thing that I find alarming in the Australian context is there's less of an interest in what in Australia than compared to America in like, what did the guys who wrote the document think, which is good. But just by ignoring democratic principles, there's no way to make sense of decisions. You can't really even predict how things are going to go. So, one case, for example, that we've been supportive of is Jenny Hocking's Palace Papers case, which succeeded in the High Court, that various papers should have been released by National Archives. She lost at the Federal Court, she lost at the Federal Court of Appeal, and she won in the High Court. And I remember sitting there in those High Court arguments thinking, this could really go either way. I mean, the words on the page give you so little that you could flip a coin. Unless you are actually considering the democratic principles that are not even necessarily new democratic principles, the democratic principles that even the Constitution back then was based on, without actually accepting some of those, you couldn't make a decision one way or the other. And because the High Court doesn't deal with those principles in an open manner, it has an impact on the lower courts as well. If the High Court was more willing to actually acknowledge those democratic principles that, as I say, haven't necessarily changed in 100 years, those democratic principles could then be used in lower courts when they're making their decisions as well. So, really, Jenny shouldn't have had to go all the way to the High Court to kind of have that decision made. So it's sort of actually, there's a lack of efficiency in it as well, I would say.
Yeah, it's not, and for a political ideology that's all about efficiency, it's a movement that
actually the irony
undermines it, doesn't it? Yeah. You mentioned Adrian Stone and a couple of other eminent names in terms of constitutional experts, Anne Toomey, George Williams, and I want to put this essay now in the context of the post-referendum. We know the outcome, which you didn't when you were writing this, although we saw it coming in many ways. And having read some of the typical or expected commentary from those within this movement since, I was struck particularly by a column by Janet Albrechtson in The Australian a week or so ago. Time is a very nebulous construct when one has jet lag, so I can't say exactly when it was, but in which she decried the words or the reactions of Anne Toomey and George Williams and others to the outcome of the referendum, who said, well, it should be difficult to change the Constitution, but it shouldn't be impossible. And her reaction to that was almost, who will rid me of these meddlesome priests, do you see, I think we both are concerned that in the post-referendum context, these campaigns will step up, and particularly around the constitutional right to who has the right to this land, whose land is it, who belongs here, who gets to say who comes and goes. What are your particular fears about that now?
So on the point about, campaign and where to next, I think there are a couple of things. Parnell McGuinness had an article in SMH, I'm sure it was in The Age as well, around the same time, saying Mabo is the problem. Yes. Mabo actually, by establishing land rights, is the reason that we can't close the gap, which is just inherently absurd.
This is a very circular argument by Parnell. Yeah.
But also written in a way that, if you didn't know any different, would kind of be persuasive. And so I think, there is a recognition that maybe they've hit on some arguments that will be useful for them long term, which I think are things to be concerned about and aware of. How can the impact of the courts be used as part of a broader cultural war, which is, exactly what's been done in the US. I was going to say something about her words about Anne and George. Oh, that's right. I in a funny way, I mean, I guess maybe it's not so surprising, but in some ways I feel sometimes, I mean, you probably have this too, in some circles you feel very conservative, in some circles you feel very progressive. I mean, I always say I feel like a campaigner once I'm with lawyers, and when I'm with lawyers, and when I'm with lawyers, I feel like a campaigner. I always feel like I'm kind of in the wrong, but in the wrong bunch.
It's a familiar feeling, yes.
But I've always kind of had this sort of, like, a small c conservative view that, the institutions of democracy that we have are actually really good if they were actually working as they were meant to, right? So the courts are fundamentally, they make a lot of sense. If we can actually access them and they're impartial and so on, they're great. Representative democracy makes a lot of sense. If you don't have the improper influence of lobbyists and money, and it should work quite well, and so on. But I think with the referendum result, and to kind of the comments of people like Anne Toomey and George Williams, our constitution, actually the fundamentals are wrong. The fundamentals do not make sense. You have to get the permission of the inheritors of a colonial legacy in order to change that system to include the people who were excluded in the first place. Like the fundamentals of that just aren't right. They don't make any sense, unlike kind of other aspects. And, what we do about that and how we can change it into the future is pretty daunting. And I don't honestly see what the pathway is. And so I guess what that does for me is just redirect my attention to what I know, which is litigation and campaigning. And I think, for Grata over the kind of next 5-10 years, I think really for us, it'll be about doubling down on how we work with communities to use litigation as a tool for change, both for land rights, but also a diverse range of issues, because, across everything that we work on, which, as I say, is, everything from freedom of information to climate change and everything in between, although there are overlaps on all of them. I think First Nations people face the most amount of illegal government activity of anyone, probably almost on a world scale, but certainly in the country.
Absolutely. I mean, they're the most incarcerated people proportionally on the planet, and I would argue the most materially disadvantaged by comparison to the rest of the population. They live in developing world conditions in one of the wealthiest countries on earth. So let's not, pull punches about that. I think
exactly. And the level of what I think is probably unlawful behavior is completely wild, but also there is very limited capacity to litigate the issue. So, you've got a legal service system that has been so whittled down to force legal services to really deal with the day in, day out, the hundreds of the same issue over and over and over again of people coming into the system and being supported to navigate it, whether that's a criminal system or, some other, a residential rights kind of system. And so I think for us at Grata, it's really about building up the litigation capacity. And I think, it's totally plausible. I mean, you see it in the climate space. 5 years ago, the climate litigation landscape on the side of litigators holding governments and corporates accountable was nothing what it is now. The EDO had just been defunded. They were making plans to make a federal organisation, and they're now a very successful national organisation. Equity Gen Lawyers, another new firm that's just started. Environmental Justice Australia was just starting out. I mean, we have a completely different landscape to 5 years ago. And I really hope that we'll have a completely different landscape again in another 5 years, where we can actually start seeing some big sticks being used among kind of the other tools as well.
And that's really, I think, a message I want to focus on today, 2-3 weeks after that outcome, less than 3 weeks, isn't it, since the outcome of the referendum, is that referenda aren't the only means, and often they're not the most efficient means to achieve meaningful change, that actually our judicial system has delivered for First Nations people more than the political system has over the last 30 years, and real advances have been made in that regard. It was interesting what you said then, reminded me very much of what Paul Keating said last week, which is that, he saw it as a folly to try to change the constitution of the colonialists in order to recognise the people that were here first. And he did hark back to those decisions that were, under his watch when he was Prime Minister. So it is cause for hope for us as a nation to think there are these avenues to go down, but we can expect more and more bitter backlash and the kinds of attacks that you cover so well in your essay as the next case proceeds and the one after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I don't want to overstate the pros of the judiciary too much in respect to First Nations people in particular. I mean, we know that there are these sort of ridiculous rates of over-incarceration by governments and by police, and the judiciary is part of that. And I think there are different parts of the judicial system that work in different ways to varying success. And, I think one example which reflects both the worst of our system and the best of our system was I was on country recently with Grata Fund and lawyers and the court on a big climate change case, which is being brought by 2 elders in the Torres Strait about climate change negligence by the Australian government. And I was talking with the court staff because, I mean, it's really funny. We're out on these, beautiful islands in these amazing kind of community halls that have been transformed lovingly by the communities, with beautiful kind of weavings and flowers and flags and decoration. I mean, it's really amazing and a lovely place to be, kind of open air, and you're in the kind of tropical kind of weather. And then in Cairns, we had some follow-up hearings, and in Cairns, we were literally in a office works kind of building. It was really weird. It was kind of like being in the office. It was honestly, it was so strange. The Office is in the kind of satirical TV show. And I remember talking to the court staff because we're going to be going back up there to Cairns in April for the closing arguments in that case, and saying, do you think we could find a bit of a nicer forum to be doing this? This feels a bit more, special and significant for everybody who's coming along. And, I sort of said, yeah, the Supreme Court building's pretty nice. Why don't we go over there? And he said, we at the federal court don't like to use Supreme Court buildings because there is such a strong association with the Supreme Court building for First Nations people and incarceration of First Nations people. Because usually if you're a First Nations person interacting with the Supreme Court building, it's because you or someone you love is being put into jail for often unreasonable circumstances, but also sometimes for reasonable circumstances, but have been caused by, the complexities that we're all aware of. And I thought, wow, that's really amazing. That's a real level of knowledge and dedication from within the court system at the federal court to say, no, we're not going to do that. But it also, at the same time is telling you a story about, what the experience is for First Nations people when they are interacting with that part of the judicial system as well.
It is. It's, the opening of your essay is particularly affecting not only the way that you describe the impact of climate change on those Australian islands to our north, but the way that the court system has gone to the people and is really taking the judiciary and the democratic process to them, and what an example that could be for the rest of our system.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, and what I realized actually in researching the essay was that, and I talk about, is that the Mabo case was actually the first time that the court ever went on country. And that was so amazing to be part of this other case. Then all of these years later, 30 odd years later, that the federal court was also going back out there, and the contrast in the court's approach back then versus today really shows how the court sort of improved. And I think also sort of, in terms of the result in the referendum, but also the legal community's backing of a yes position in the referendum partly reflects the way that the legal system, through native title law or through other areas of law, has actually, through attending on-country hearings, has actually been forced to kind of understand and confront face-to-face the reality of First Nations law, LORE, cultural practices and so on, and really actually appreciate how real and valuable that those are, which I think sort of means that in some way the judicial system and some lawyers have sort of been educated in a way about First Nations cultures that the rest of the country could probably benefit from.
Absolutely. And your essay is an excellent introduction to that. It was a great outcome for you in the High Court today, but a couple of other significant decisions as well have come down around the Catholic Church's use of, the death of priests to try and insulate itself against claims from those that have suffered abuse at the hands of the clergy, and probably the one that's most likely to attract the ire of the people you talk about in your essay. And I'm looking forward to Miss Albrechtson's next column, Dr. Albrechtson's next column in the Australian, because there was a decision now by the High Court that the government's stripping of citizenship of people convicted of terrorist offences, or certainly in the case of Ben Breaker, is against the Constitution. What sort of backlash do you expect to see to that one?
I mean, it will be backlash from people who don't agree with the outcome, who want to be able to do what they want to do. And I mean, in a way, I mean, for those people, I'm not sure how deep the philosophy goes, and I'm sure it's different for different people. But I mean, I think for some people at a surface level, it is literally just, I want to be able to do this thing. My government, the people, my party, the people who I've elected at a certain time want to be able to do this thing, and thus they should be able to do it. But I think for some people, it goes to this deeper point, which is this idea that the executive and the legislature shouldn't have to deal with the High Court, that the High Court, there's this sort of language that came out of America that it was sort of counter-majoritarian for courts to do their job, because the idea is that the majority said yes to this government, and so they should be able to do what they want. But the reason that, if you go back to conservative, like first principles, actually, the reason that you've got a court system there is because they knew back in 1901 that you needed to have an accountability mechanism. It's not good enough to expect an electorate to be able to have the power to deliver accountability at an election term cycle. It's just not, and I mean, that's just accelerated now with the issues that we have today in terms of media cycles and so on. But to me, that's this sort of, I feel kind of funny, because I think it's a kind of conservative point in a way, is to say, if you've got an executive and you've got a legislature and you've got an institution that is designed to hold them accountable, why do we nationally not embrace that and think of it in that way? And it's interesting, the High Court has these very high approval ratings in terms of trusted government authorities. It's, I think, just below the AFP, which the AFP is number one, tells you something else as well. But it's very consistently, the High Court is rated as a very trusted body. And I think that also reflects the fact that it's reflected in the fact that in the No campaign, the messaging, the original messaging about, the Voice being bad because of High Court litigation and judges and so on, activist judges, it didn't get cut through at all. It wasn't effective as a message. What was effective as a message was the related point, which is land rights, which are kind of connected back to the court. But I think it does tell you a bit about where that kind of camp is coming from and where they're thinking about, and they just don't want to be held accountable by the judiciary. And I just think that that's just an untenable thing to allow to happen. And you see, I mean, there are far greater concerning things happening at the moment, but you see out of Netanyahu's government this year as well, essentially the stripping of the court to be able to provide that sort of accountability role. And I don't think we're at any point anywhere near that in Australia. I think we've got a lot to be proud of, but I do think that if we aren't careful about holding onto it and protecting it now, and I think particularly, on the left, being very careful and strategic about how to respond, I actually think the worst possible thing would be have kind of this kind of progressive movement for progressive lawyers. I think it would just progressive appointments. I think it'd be a disaster, because then you kind of just inflame each other and you run down the rabbit hole to the US. But I do think that there is a role for Australians in thinking about, okay, culturally, how do we care about and think about the court and its role? But also, how do we exercise that care? It's by actually accessing the courts and doing our role in the same way that it's a civic role to go to kind of the election and cast your vote and do it in an informed way. How do you look at litigation as a way of exercising your kind of civic duties and supporting litigation as an exercise of your civic duty?
Yeah, I think it's essential, because as you alluded to then, what we're grappling with is not a conservative movement, it's a reactionary populist movement that's actually seeking to undermine the principles of our Westminster democracy, remove a pillar of governance that is there very deliberately to keep a check and balance on the elected representatives, and to couch that in terms that that's somehow more in keeping with the will of the people. So to fight what is a reactionary populist right-wing agenda with a reactionary populist left-wing agenda would get us much further into trouble. And really, it behooves all of us to be small c conservative when it comes to protecting the institutions that have held our democracy in good stead. Because really, not to put too fine a point on it, but when you do see, and we're not at that stage in Australia yet, but when you do see governments stripping back the power of the judiciary or trying to, rid me of these meddlesome priests in the Shakespearean term, you're seeing really a step towards a fascist or authoritarian state in which there is no control on the power of the popularly elected government. But what popularly elected then means is not what it used to either, because people are making those decisions in a fully informed way. So it really is, it's a very important essay. And I think what you've done with it is, without being at all alarmist or hyperbolic, you've really laid out how this happens in Australia, how it is different than in the US. And as we've talked about today, so clearly around who controls our land, whether that's about immigration or First Nations people or land rights, but that these attacks are there and they are growing, and they're growing in boldness and will since the referendum. I just want to remind people to put any questions in the Q&A. I can see we've got one, which is kind of, I think we're in a good position to take this now. It's from Roger Tonkin, and he says, how vulnerable to and how resilient against is our law, our democracy and our public interest to the misinformation and disinformation that's now prevalent in public debate and in all forms of media? Do you want to just reflect on that a little?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about using litigation is that when you get into court, it does not matter the BS that you might want to come up with. It's not going to work. And that's, I think you see that in watching former politicians or politicians totally squirm when they're under inquiry by former judges. I mean, you see Catherine Holmes in her inquiry with Scott Morrison in relation to robo-debt. She was not taking any BS. She was asking very directly, answer the question, stick to the question. And he or anyone cannot get away in that context, in that dynamic, from the truth. And that's the thing that I really, really love about the court and the role of it increasingly over time, as we see this sort of influx of mis and disinformation that is likely to get much, much worse if it gets better at all, before if it gets better. And I think, that's why, to me, destroying or degrading the role of the court is even more dangerous in this context, because people know it is the last place that you can't get away with spin and PR. And, for example, that example I gave previously, that, in Santa Teresa, the government had claimed $2 million in dodgy rental debts, essentially to try and get rid of the case. Got into court. The tribunal immediately said, where's your evidence? They said, oh, can we have an adjournment so we can try and find some? They came back after the adjournment. Sorry, we don't have any evidence to substantiate the claim. The tribunal chucks it out. But, this happens all the time. And it is because of the role of the court being interested in fact that, you actually have a decent outcome. There was just another example from the Territory, another win that actually didn't get a lot of coverage because it was sort of happened around the referendum time, but Larambo, a community also in the Territory, which has had a similar series of litigation. Residents in Larambo, their taps were producing drinking water that had 2.5 times the safe level of uranium. Uranium is not something I want at any safe drinking level personally, and I don't think anybody does, but that's to give you a mind for scale of how bad the water was and is across the Territory, actually, just because of naturally occurring uranium in the bore water. And you could fix that problem if you wanted to, as the Territory government, as the landlord, by installing reverse osmosis filtration taps that you can buy at Bunnings. It's like an attachment. It's so freaking simple to try to stop poisoning people who are renting off you. And at one point we had this sort of dilemma of saying, do we just go and install these taps, because it's ridiculous. During the length of this litigation, and the community decided, no, we want to just focus on the litigation, keep going, and establish the precedent and not have any risk to it. But in the process of the litigation, before they got a win, which was to say, no, Territory government, you do have to provide safe drinking water to these homes, the government installed a safe filtration system in the community, a multi-million-dollar safe water facility, which was great, but it's clearly designed quite cynically to avoid the precedent. And I think that's the thing about mis and disinformation. The government could go and say, yeah, we've solved the water problem. We've provided safe filtration systems in Laramba, but the court doesn't let them. That's not enough for the court. It's not enough to have like a positive story to have covered the bases. They've actually, have to actually have a legal standard applied. in terms of the role of the law going forward on mis and disinformation, I mean, I think that's the kind of million-dollar question at the moment for a lot of people, certainly something that we're working on. I mean, I think it's really difficult that so long as social media companies and media companies, their profits are completely resulting from algorithms that depend on clickable, shareable information, we know that disinformation does, meet the needs of that algorithm. And until those profit systems are changed and regulated better, I don't know how it changes, but I also don't really know how likely that pathway is to being achieved. I mean, the EU was sort of trying, and, we'll kind of have to watch the space, I think.
It's a particularly challenging space, of course, because America being culturally dominant in this field and having freedom of speech and as its number one public cultural concern puts us at odds with some of those European attempts. And stay tuned for a per capita development in that space. It's an area that I've long been passionate about, and the public square. So we'll be doing some work there similarly, and should have a chat about that. Another question from Roger, and I think this one actually, this is interesting because I think it speaks to what you were talking about before about the democratic principles that the law seeks to uphold. So Roger says here, terms such as democracy and equality don't actually exist in the Constitution. So how can the Constitution have any role in the protection of either? It's really what you were getting at in terms of those principles. Yeah.
So I think the way to understand it best is through actually those implied freedom decisions. So those original decisions. So you go back to the 80s, and what the court found there is, okay, you look at the Constitution as a whole. What does it try and achieve? Responsible and representative government.
Yep.
And understanding what those words mean. And obviously, with law, always with language, there is, vagary, but they come to be over time sort of accepted definitions and boundaries to those words. And the court basically said, in order for those aspects of the Constitution that imbue, it's the whole point of the Constitution, for that to be sustained, there must be an implied freedom to political communication. And so what that means to me is you kind of are going back to those principles of representative and responsible government. What is the point of our Constitution? And that thus can then be used to inform those other kind of, principles such as democracy. Equality is a different sort of question. And I think for questions like equality, democracy is particularly relevant when you're talking about constitutional issues, but the High Court deals with all sorts of issues all the time. It doesn't just deal with constitutional issues. And I think the thing that's most important for it to be able to provide, it's not the role really of the courts to provide justice in that kind of popular sense of justice, right? It's to provide I think accountability is a better frame to look at it. But, we actually have, I think that, really what the court's role is in terms of those equality principles is upholding legislation that provides rights. And while we don't have a national charter of rights, and that is a serious problem in this country and puts us out of step with the rest of the kind of world, what we do is have vast legislative rights, across all sorts of things. And, that you can see reflected in the remote housing and water cases that, that's using Residential Tenancies Act legislation. There's no kind of fancy, sexy equality sort of right there. It's just everybody in the country has a right to under Residential Tenancies Acts. And so I think that's a way of looking at it, and we're looking at the role of the court. It's really about enforcing those legislated rights. And at a practical level of how you enable that to happen, it kind of gets you to these sort of technical things that I spend a lot of my time kind of working on and thinking about, which is how do you actually enforce those rights, and who has the ability to enforce those rights? So, in a kind of climate context, regulators like ASIC and the ACCC have the power to kind of enforce rights around greenwashing. But they are actively stating that they are waiting for essentially civil society to achieve the precedents through courts for them to follow. And that's because of the degree of regulatory capture in this country. But I think my point is that in making legislation and making new legislation, we've got to be thinking about who has the ability to enforce that legislation. So if you want to kind of create new rights in respect of mis and disinformation, or you want to make new rights in respect of gender, or whatever it might be, you've got to make sure that there is the ability for citizens to actually bring those enforcement mechanisms to court, so that the court has an opportunity to uphold those equality principles that exist already inherently in the legislation that we have in Parliament.
So protecting our courts is really, really important. And other than reading your excellent essay, and I do point everyone back to the chat where you can click on a link, get a discount and buy a copy of this. If you're not subscribed to this series, why not? It's a fantastic series. But I've also put in the chat the link to the Grata Fund's website, because people can get involved, can't they, Isabelle? They can donate, or they can even volunteer to help your work.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, please definitely get in touch. I mean, I think some of the kind of mechanisms that we focus on are things like making it more affordable to get to court, so that citizens can actually bring those accountability pieces of litigation.
Fantastic. Look, we're pretty much out of time, but thank you so much for joining us to talk about this essay. It is really, I read it very quickly the first time, and then went back and made my notes for today. It's very readable. You're an excellent writer, Isabelle. I have to say, it's a lovely essay, even though enraging at times. But thank you so much. Please do, everyone, jump onto the Grata Fund's website. I know we've got quite a few people here today from the philanthropic sector, and some with quite a lot of legal background as well. So if you want to volunteer or donate to the organisation,
or sign up to our newsletter. We've got a huge few weeks coming up. So the climate matter, the negligence climate case coming out of the Torres Strait, which I mentioned, had the on-country hearings in June. We're going to be in Melbourne for 3 weeks from next week because the expert testimony is starting. So that's going to be lots of fun. So if anyone's in Melbourne and wants to pop into the federal court, let me know, because it's going to be really interesting, I think.
Might try and see you there. It'd be lovely to catch up with you anyway. But yeah, do it is a very worthwhile project to support, and particularly you can see today the results of some of that support that you've had from the community in such a fantastic outcome in the High Court. Congratulations again.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone.
Bye.